it has to be the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, because it's the three of us as we were at that point.
He had it all: fame, fortune, and a family band that defined an era. But behind the Bee Gees' glittering success was a hidden storm of rivalry, regret, and heartbreak. Now, Barry Gibb, the last living brother, is finally telling the story the world was never supposed to hear. What tore them apart? Why did he stay silent for decades? And what truth still haunts him to this day? This isn't just a story about music, it's about the price of legacy and the pain of being left behind. For decades, the Bee Gees dazzled the world with shimmering harmonies, disco anthems, and a glamorous image that seemed untouched by conflict. But behind those million-dollar smiles and chart-topping hits, something far more fragile was unraveling. Barry Gibb, the last surviving member of the legendary group, has recently broken his silence, and what he's revealed isn't just surprising, it's heartbreaking. The Bee Gees weren't just a band, they were three brothers, Barry, Robin, and Maurice, bound by music but often torn apart by ego, pressure, and unspoken pain. In public, they were the picture of unity, but offstage, their bond was tested time and time again. And now, decades after their greatest triumphs, Barry is finally telling the story they never dared to share. Why did they keep it hidden for so long? And what truths are only now coming to light? The answers, as you'll see, reveal a side of the Bee Gees the world never truly knew. It was 1969, just as the Bee Gees were beginning to make their mark on the global music scene, when everything nearly collapsed. Robin Gibb, the group's distinct vibrato voice, stunned fans by walking away from the band. What the public didn't see was the growing tension behind the scenes, a struggle that had been brewing for years. Barry, the eldest, had quickly emerged as the face of the Bee Gees. His soaring falsetto and undeniable charisma drew praise from critics and management alike. But to Robin, that spotlight began to feel like a shadow. Manager Robert Stigwood had placed his bets on Barry as the group's frontman, leaving Robin feeling overlooked, an accessory to someone else's success. That resentment would eventually boil over. In interviews, Barry later admitted, "I was getting too much attention, and it hurt Robin." And it did, deeply. Determined to prove himself, Robin launched a solo career, releasing Robin's Reign in 1970. Meanwhile, Barry and Maurice tried to keep the Bee Gees afloat with the album Cucumber Castle. But without Robin, the magic felt fractured, and so did the brotherhood. What started as creative tension had become a full-blown emotional divide, and for the first time, the Bee Gees weren't just breaking charts, they were breaking apart. But this rift was only the beginning of a much longer, more painful journey. The Bee Gees found their way back to each other in 1970, but not without scars. Their reunion brought relief to fans and revitalized the group's momentum. By 1977, with the release of Saturday Night Fever, they had not only redefined disco, they had become its very symbol. But behind the glitter and platinum records, tension simmered just beneath the surface. In the studio, disagreements were constant. Who would sing lead? Whose lyrics would make the cut? For Barry, the natural leader with a gift for melody, these creative battles came with the territory. But for Robin and Maurice, it often felt like being passengers in a vehicle they once helped build. Maurice, the often overlooked twin and the group's quiet stabilizer, tried desperately to keep the peace. But as Barry once recalled, "We argued about everything, from who would sing the first line to what style the song should have." These weren't just artistic debates, they were personal. What made their harmonies so special, that blend of voices, instinct, and emotion, also made collaboration fraught with unspoken competition. They were brothers first and bandmates second. But even love has its limits when pride is on the line. And while the music never faltered, the emotional distance between them quietly grew. Barry would later admit that even during their peak, we stood on the edge of something fragile. Their success was staggering, but the brotherhood, once broken, had never fully healed. And soon, the cracks would begin to widen again. For Barry Gibb, fame came at a steep cost, and nothing could prepare him for the losses that followed. On January 12, 2003, Maurice Gibb, the group's heartbeat and Barry's closest musical confidant, died unexpectedly during emergency surgery. He was just 53. Barry later admitted he was blindsided. "We thought he would be okay," he told the New York Times in 2020. And then suddenly, he was gone. Maurice wasn't just a keyboardist or background vocalist, he was the glue that held the brothers together. Without him, the Bee Gees were no longer whole, and Barry knew it. But the heartbreak wasn't over. Less than a decade later, on May 20, 2012, Robin Gibb passed away after a long and painful battle with liver and colon cancer. He was 62. And for Barry, the loss was like watching his own reflection fade. "It was like losing half of my soul," he said, holding back tears. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Barry confessed, "I wish I'd been with Robin more, especially in his final days." The regrets were raw. The silence between them, once filled with music, now echoed with what could never be said. And then there was Andy. The youngest Gibb brother, never a member of the Bee Gees, but a rising star in his own right, died in 1988 at just 30 years old. The cause? Myocarditis linked to years of drug use. Barry had tried to save him, tried to steer him clear of the darkness. "I did everything I could," he told Variety in 2017, "but I couldn't save Andy. That haunts me forever." 3 brothers gone. And Barry Gibb, once part of a harmonious quartet, was left standing alone. Not as a superstar, not even as a survivor, but as a man who would have traded every hit, every accolade, just to have his brothers back. Long before the fame, before the spotlight, Barry Gibb was just a boy recovering from a trauma few ever knew about. At just 2 years old, in a quiet home on the Isle of Man, Barry suffered a devastating accident. A kettle of boiling water spilled over his small body, inflicting life-threatening burns. What followed were more than 2 years of surgeries, isolation, and excruciating recovery in hospital. He would later confess that he remembered very little of the pain, but the scars, both physical and emotional, never left him. Family stories and fleeting sensations filled in the blanks. And as he grew, Barry became more withdrawn, more guarded. But that wasn't the only shadow he carried. In 2017, Barry shared something he had buried for decades, a chilling moment from his childhood that changed him forever. At the age of 4, a stranger attempted to lure him in what he now recognizes as a predatory act. Though nothing physical happened, the encounter left him shaken, anxious, and afraid. He never told his family, not his parents, not even his brothers. In those days, he explained, you didn't talk about things like that. You just kept it inside and tried to forget. But Barry never really forgot. That early moment of fear lingered, silently shaping the man he became. It made him protective, private, aware of dangers others might overlook. Even as millions of fans celebrated his voice, his charm, and his fame, Barry remained emotionally cautious, sometimes even distant from those who loved him most. Later, he would admit that this inner reserve created rifts with his brothers, particularly Robin, who often felt shut out, not by anger, but by silence. These early wounds, never seen in music videos or magazine covers, left a deep imprint on Barry's soul. And in many ways, they explained why, despite the noise of celebrity, he often felt like the quietest voice in the room. In the late 1960s, the Bee Gees were riding high. To Love Somebody, Massachusetts, their names were etched onto vinyl and adored across continents. But by the early 1970s, the applause had started to fade. And for the Gibb brothers, silence was more terrifying than criticism. Between 1972 and 1975, their albums fell flat. Life in a Tin Can, Mr. Natural, reviewed as dull, dismissed as outdated. And suddenly, the Bee Gees weren't just out of fashion, they were out of options. Barry Gibb remembered it vividly. "We did everything we could, but no one cared. Radio stations stopped playing us, audiences stopped showing up. Concerts that once filled arenas were now reduced to tiny clubs, sometimes just a handful of curious strangers in a smoky American bar." And the pressure wasn't just professional. With families to feed and reputations slipping away, Barry, Robin, and Maurice felt the walls closing in. At one point, Barry even considered leaving music altogether for an office job, a decision he called scary but real. Then in 1975 came a call they hadn't expected. Manager Robert Stigwood asked the Bee Gees to write music for an obscure dance film with a modest budget and no major expectations. The name? Saturday Night Fever. In a cramped Miami apartment, surrounded by uncertainty, Barry and his brothers started to write. And something extraordinary happened. Stayin' Alive, Night Fever, How Deep Is Your Love? Each track came effortlessly, almost like they were being channeled, not written. Barry would later say, "We weren't trying to make disco music, we just wrote what felt right." The soundtrack exploded, selling over 40 million copies and turning the Bee Gees into global icons. Practically overnight, they went from musical afterthoughts to kings of the dance floor. But even as the world danced to their beat, Barry Gibb kept one eye on the past. The fall from grace had been swift, and success, he now knew, could vanish just as quickly. Their reinvention wasn't just about survival, it was a reminder. Sometimes, from the darkest place comes the brightest light. By the late 1970s, the Bee Gees were everywhere. Radio, television, movie soundtracks. They weren't just riding the disco wave, they were leading it. But what the Gibb brothers didn't expect was that the wave would suddenly turn into a storm. In 1979, a backlash began sweeping through the United States. The Disco Sucks movement, fueled by angry rock purists, conservative commentators, and racial tensions simmering beneath the surface, took aim at the genre they had helped define. And soon, it wasn't just disco under attack, it was the Bee Gees themselves. The turning point came on July 12, 1979, at Chicago's Comiskey Park. It was supposed to be a baseball game, but what unfolded was a cultural riot. Thousands gathered for Disco Demolition Night. Disco records were blown up in the outfield, among them albums by the Bee Gees. Barry later recalled, "We felt like the whole world had turned against us. They didn't just hate disco, they hated us." Almost overnight, American radio stations stopped playing their songs, even tracks that weren't disco. Concerts were canceled, venues turned cold, and the ridicule was relentless. Barry once joked that even a cow soiled his car after a minor accident, as if the universe had joined the mob. But behind the humor was real pain. The group, who had climbed back from obscurity just a few years earlier, were now forced to retreat from the spotlight again. Robin, always the most emotionally vulnerable, took the backlash especially hard. He often wondered aloud, what did we do to deserve this? Unable to release music under the Bee Gees' name, the brothers shifted gears. They began writing for other artists, massive hits like Woman in Love for Barbra Streisand, Islands in the Stream for Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers, and Heartbreaker for Dionne Warwick. It was a brilliant workaround, but it came with a price. Barry later admitted that hiding behind other artists left them feeling erased. If Bee Gees songs couldn't get played, we'd let others sing them. Maurice, ever the optimist, quietly confessed it was the darkest period they had ever known. In the end, the backlash taught them a cruel lesson. Fame is fleeting. And in America, yesterday's darlings could become today's targets.
But they also learned something else. Resilience could be just as powerful as talent. With their name blacklisted on radio and disco under siege, the Bee Gees faced a cruel truth in the early 1980s. They could no longer release music as themselves. But the Gibb brothers weren't done, not creatively and certainly not emotionally. Instead of retreating, they reinvented. Operating behind the scenes, they began writing and producing songs for other artists, anonymously at first. And the results were staggering. Woman in Love for Barbra Streisand, Heartbreaker for Dionne Warwick, Islands in the Stream for Dolly Parton and Kenny Rogers, all of them global hits, none of them credited to the Bee Gees on the radio. Barry later told the New York Times, "If Bee Gees songs couldn't get played, we'd let others sing them." It wasn't bitterness, it was strategy, survival, adaptation. But there was a price. Stripped of their name, the brothers began to feel invisible, ghosts in an industry they had once ruled. For Maurice, always the cheerful heart of the group, it was a deeply humbling period. Privately, he confessed that this was their darkest chapter, not because they lacked success, but because they'd lost their identity. For Barry, it was a quiet grief. The world was still singing their songs, but no one knew it was them. They had become the engine behind someone else's spotlight. Still, the work gave them purpose, and perhaps more importantly, it kept them together. This ghostwriting era wasn't just a career move, it was a reminder that even when the world turns its back, true artistry finds a way forward. And for the Bee Gees, it became the bridge between rejection and redemption.
When Robin Gibb passed away in 2012, Barry Gibb stood alone. The Bee Gees were officially over. The harmonies had fallen silent. And for Barry, it wasn't just the end of a band, it was the end of a life he had known since childhood. But he wasn't ready to let the music die. In the years that followed, Barry embarked on something deeply personal, a mission not of fame, but of remembrance. In 2021, he released Greenfields, the Gibb Brothers Songbook, Volume 1, an album that reimagined classic Bee Gees songs through a country and bluegrass lands. Featuring musical legends like Dolly Parton, Keith Urban, and Alison Krauss, the project wasn't a commercial gamble. It was a love letter, a return to roots. Barry revealed that before disco and pop, the Gibb family had grown up listening to Hank Williams and the Everly Brothers. And for Barry, country music wasn't just a genre, it was home. Greenfields went straight to #1 in the UK and Australia, proving that the Bee Gees' songwriting still resonated across generations. But more than the charts, it gave Barry something else: healing. He told NPR in 2021, "Each time I step on stage, I feel Maurice and Robin with me. I sing for them, as if they're still right there beside me." Despite his battle with arthritis, Barry continued performing, most notably on the Mythology Tour, where he brought Bee Gees classics back to life in front of thousands. Every lyric, every note, a thread connecting him to the brothers he lost. But this wasn't about nostalgia. Barry took an active role in preserving their legacy, working on documentaries like How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, overseeing the digitization of old recordings, and helping bring their story to a younger generation that knew them only as disco legends. He wanted the world to see what the Bee Gees truly were: storytellers, poets in harmony, survivors of a musical and emotional journey unlike any other. And through it all, Barry Gibb kept writing, kept singing, kept remembering. Because for him, music was more than memory. It was a lifeline, a final mission to turn grief into legacy and silence into song. Barry Gibb has lived what most musicians only dream of: global fame, timeless hits, and a name etched into music history. But behind the glittering legacy lies a truth far more sobering. He is the last man standing.
Gone are the harmonies that once defined a generation. Gone are the brothers who stood beside him through every rise and fall. And now, in the quiet of reflection, Barry carries not just the Bee Gees' legacy, but the weight of memory itself. "I would trade all the hits," he once said, "to have my brothers here." Those aren't the words of a pop icon. They're the words of a brother, haunted not by the spotlight, but by the empty space it can never fill. And yet, he continues. With every performance, every interview, every lovingly reimagined song, Barry turns pain into purpose. He doesn't just honor his brothers, he speaks to them, through music, through memory, through melody. In the end, the Bee Gees were never just a band. They were a bond, fragile, beautiful, and, like their harmonies, never quite the same without all three voices. But because Barry still sings, the story still lives.